Why are you punching React?
Well, we can talk about that. We
Yeah.
can talk. We can talk about why I'm punching. We can talk about whatever you like. So there we go. So can someone on chat side just confirm that you can hear JLarky over here?
Yeah. And sorry for the mess. We're moving soon, so there are like some boxes. I don't know if you can see it, but
Yeah,
maybe
it's
not.
okay. It's all good. I can't see very much. Yeah, you can hear him. Okay, perfect. All
Yeah.
right. Well, I'll move myself a little bit off of the. I'm kind of in a weird spot here. I'll go like I'll do this. There we go. All right, so welcome. So I just want to make sure J Larky is okay. Is there something else you prefer? I call you different names, whatever you want.
Yeah, I'm a man of different names on the internet. I think most people know me as JLarky, so it feels fine. It's
Yeah. All right. Okay. Sounds good. Well, thanks for popping on. Um.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. Yeah. So we kind of have like somebody we mutually follow on X. And the suggestion was made that you and I should talk for reasons. I guess insert reasons here. Um. Probably to do with the all the rants that I have about front end web development and whatnot. Um,
So I've
so
heard.
yeah, it's like something I'm a little bit famous for. Um, uh, so here I turned up the Discord there so that people can hear you a little bit better on the stream. Um, and I know you have a background in web development as well. So how about we just start with kind of like why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself and your experience, and we'll just see where we go.
Yeah. So I I don't like to. It's like those like bands that don't like to be set to a genre, right? It's like
Yeah.
I don't like to call myself kind of like a very specific things because like I started the first like language I learned was like Basic, and I just had like a book about Basic. I didn't have a computer back then, so like I just like ran all of that stuff in my mind. So like I never written like a line of basic like on the computer, right? Then I learned like Pascal. Again, like I just asked my like teacher to give me like a pirated like Turbo Pascal and just read through the documentation in like a mixed like English and Russian until I can like figure it out
Sweet.
enough, right? So one of my like first applications that like people used were like in Delphi,
Right.
and then in university, I kind of like started doing kind of like more web stuff. So at that time, that meant like LAMP, kind of like
Yeah.
PHP, jQuery, and all that stuff. I did a bit of Ruby. I was sure that like Python and Ruby are going to be like a bigger languages than PHP and all that stuff. So
Yeah.
I I did a lot, and when Go was coming out, I already knew Erlang, and I'm convinced that like Rob Pike was like very inspired by Erlang when he was doing Go. So it was like, oh, this is a feature from Erlang. This is a feature from Erlang. So
Right.
it like I was like sure that I would probably like spend my career doing Go at that time.
Right.
But I got a job at startup, and they were looking for like Erlang engineers. And because of like how small the community is, like the hiring process for like Erlang jobs is along the lines of like, hey, do you know Erlang? Yes. Oh, cool. Everyone else said no. So like you're hired.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So and around like 2015, we were working on an app with Knockout.js. So all the like signal stuff is like very like at home. So we were working on Knockout.js, and we had like a lot of like kind of like issues with like just like using JavaScript and the kind of like the string-based templating where you're like on click like this string and it's like I hope that this isn't function name, but like who knows? And I hope that it
Right.
takes like one argument and not three, and like who knows, right?
Right.
But that was a thing where like me and our like CTO, we were like just discussing like kind of like what can we do here, and his thing was like we should do TypeScript because like well this like this string based stuff is like not great,
Right.
right? Let's do TypeScript. And I was the one who like in 2014, like the end of the year, I think React just like was just out for like a less than a year at that time. I was like convincing him to use React for our new project instead of
Yeah.
Knockout, right? So I'm not like one of those like engineers who kind of like had to use React because someone else told them to.
Right.
I was the one who like had to make a case, right, for like to adopt this new unproven technology that no one knows and so on, right? So
Right.
so that puts me in a very like funny position, and it also like as stuff happened in that company, like I was starting doing like more and more front end, and by the time that we were kind of like pivoting and launching like a new project, they were like, "Oh, you had this like idea with React, like you do that." Just
Right.
so they gave me kind of like the whole front end of like our new application, and that's kind of like how I became like the front end guy for some reason.
Yeah,
After
of
like
course.
10
Yeah.
years, maybe not 10 years, but like maybe like 5 years working on like a backend, and it's like, hey, now you're the front end guy,
Right.
and yeah, so depends on depends on the time, depends on like what you want to think, right? I can be anyone, and uh that's why it's I'm finding myself into like this fun position like on Twitters, right? Where uh I think that like HTMX is good because that's kind of like how I started building apps, right? But also I might kind of like know some of the things how like front end is built, right? On high enough level where kind of like where like Rich Harris could be upset with me, right?
Of course. Yeah.
It-
Yeah. Yeah. I like how you have that banner right at the very top of your X profile there. I think I have it right here. It's right here.
yeah,
Why are you like this? It's great. I like it. Yeah,
yeah. I
okay.
think now it's up to like almost like 400 likes.
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, that's going to get attention, right? It's like the person who's doing the micro benchmarks on all the different languages and Casey Muratori is just like completely annoyed by those benchmarks. Like it's a good way to get some attention. You annoy someone who has some gravitas and then you get some attention yourself. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like you have like more of like a varied background. It's not that you're necessarily a back end, front end, in uh, a box, so to speak.
right.
Um, so
I like
I'm
to joke that I'm like if anything I'm like a webmaster,
yeah,
but this is also like selling it a bit short because like I did like some native development, right? I'm
right,
I'm writing like some CLI applications and all that stuff. So like
right,
I used to work in like a very small startup for like kind of like most of my career, and you do everything that needs to be done there, right?
right,
It's like it's not like you're put inside of like a big team and like you solve tickets, right? It's like that's
right,
that's all that you do,
right,
right? And a small startup is like, well, you need like React Native application, like someone has to write it.
right. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. So a poly programmer of sorts. You're not afraid to jump into a variety of different things.
Right.
That would be fair to say. Okay.
Yeah, I thought my bar was kind of like don't do PHP and Java, but I still did PHP and Java, so it's like
Yeah, 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 yeah. So okay, I mean, I have like a billion questions, but um, so tell me the difference between from your perspective when you would reach for something like React and when you would reach for something like HTMX. Maybe let's start there.
Right. Yeah. So I would say it's always like a it's not as easy, right? And there is this like a kind of like worse is better, like I say from like 50 years ago, right? It's
Right.
like those Lisp guys, they were doing everything the best way possible, and those like I forgot who was he like referring to. Maybe like C guys, I guess, like right, like the Unix guys. So and
Right.
like those Unix guys are like scrappy. They're doing everything kind of like by the uh by like thin margins. It's like it barely works, but like who kind of like won, right?
Right.
So there's always kind of like uh, there's always real world, right? Is like and that's funny. Like Ryan Carniato, who kind of like follow a lot, he just did his article about like kind of like a review of like framework kind of like state in 2024, right? And like the like one of the last kind of like paragraphs that he has is like, well, sometimes the best framework to choose is not the best framework, right?
Right.
Like something along those lines. But that's kind of like the thing that you have to keep in mind is that like, well, you can kind of like calculate and figure out is like, well, that's the best thing, right? Like
Right.
it works the best, it's fastest, it's like whatever, right? But like for a business, um, for business decisions, you have to use micro frontends or something like that, right? And like micro frontends are never the best solution.
Yeah.
They're always a solution for a problem where you exhausted all the other options, right?
Right. Right. Okay. So
So I'm giving like no answer basically, right? It's it's
you're
it's
being
it's
politically
it's
neutral.
tricky,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, eh, I guess like to turn it into an answer is like you have to know like what your company is doing, right? And uh, overall, like I always try to make some sort of bets. It's like, well, that this is maybe like a thing that like is not popular right now, right? But like will be popular later, right? And you just have to make sure that your bets like don't become like the biggest the biggest issue, right? In your project, right? They are like contained somehow. And as of right now, right, the React seems safe and HTMX seems risky,
Right.
right? So, and like what do you do if you have a situation like that? Well, you use HTMX in like in places where it's not risky, right? So
Right.
that's why a lot of people uh using HTMX in like a in just like a smaller project, right? Where you can just like, well, I can probably rewrite that like the whole thing in 1 week, right? And
Right.
just like do it. Or they're using it in some sort of like internal tools where some amount of like polish like it is expected that like when you click on something like the spinner is not going to show up or something like that, and it's like,
Right.
well, like it's if you're doing something like that, it's like it's much easier to do it in like in HTML than something else.
Right. Right. Okay. Um. So how do you? Okay. So then, why don't you give us your perspective on what you think about things like web components or even just in general not using frameworks or libraries and when that's like a good thing.
Right. This happened like too long time ago, probably like no one remembers, but at the time of uh at the time when jQuery was like in the position where React is right now, right? When it was like the default option, like people like to turn off their brains, right? Like they like to give kind of like AI all their tasks. They like to give like Stack Overflow all their tasks, right? And like the thing that I remember was you would go to Stack Overflow and like the top questions were like, how do I sort arrays in jQuery? How do I like, right? It's like
Yeah.
And we are at the point right now is like, how do I sort arrays in React,
React.
right? And
Yeah.
it's like, well, there is actually kind of like a nuance to it, right? Like, well, you would sort arrays in JavaScript, not React, but it's like, well, if you're actually doing like this thing, right, you need to add keys and like and so on, right? So it's like it's 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 funny because like it just shows that like people don't understand what they're doing, and that's true for like everyone, right?
Right.
And uh all of those questions of like how do I sort arrays in jQuery, how do I sort arrays in React, right? It just it well, the thing that I was going to bring up is the like there was a website back in the day that was like vanilla JS framework. So you go to that, and that was in the time of like jQuery UI. And in jQuery UI, what you would do is like you would say like, oh, I need like modals, dialogues, popovers. Like you will put like a few check marks, and you press download, and it will like kind of like bundle the thing for you. So you would have
Right.
like a like .js file that you can put in your like server, right?
That's right.
And it's
That's
like
right.
someone did this thing for vanilla JS, and so they were like, oh, he wanted to sort arrays, just like add a checkbox. Oh, he wanted like do this, and it's like it's all the features that are just like built in the browser, right? And you just put a bunch of checkboxes, and in the end, it just gives you like an empty like file, and it's like, yeah, it's all built in.
Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah. I remember. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so the like the that framework, the vanilla JS framework, it like every year it gets better,
Yeah.
right? Every year it can do more and more stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like now it can sort arrays without like mutating arrays, right? And
Right.
now it can do kind of like this and that. And it is important to like to realize once you're typing to your chat GPT is like how to sort arrays in React is like, what am I doing? Like, why am I so out of touch of like what is going on with the platform?
Right.
Right? And I uh, I will go there first. So I think my biggest kind of like issue with the platform is that people will say seriously, believing in what they're saying, stuff like, well, I will use the platform because I know that like this component is going to work in like 100 years from now.
Right.
And I think this is the stupidest thing ever that you can say because
Yeah.
first of all, is that I used a bunch of like platform tools that like those websites don't work anymore,
Right.
right? There were like some security kind of like consideration of like, well, we can't do this way anymore, right? Like I remember the web before course, right? Like some of the websites that like they won't work today, right? Because they like the course didn't exist yet, and like you
Right.
could do some things that like are not possible today, right? And similarly, I used some of the like the service workers API before they were service workers. They were like cache management APIs or something like that. I don't remember the names, but like
Yeah.
I have a website that like doesn't work anymore because it was using the platform, right? So like I like on the first part is like this website is going to work in 100 years. No, it's like there are a bunch of examples of like stuff like stopping working, right? Or there are like kind of like backward compatible ways of like work modes or quirk modes. I don't remember how that with
Cork.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
they would have something like that, or you have like a use strict right now, like declaratives for your JavaScript or like top module, right?
Right.
Is like there are some things that like used to work in JavaScript that like but don't work today anymore, right? And
Right.
it's like in JavaScript and HTML and CSS, like you whatever, like you pick it. It like there were features that like were deprecated from the platform in like different ways, right?
Yes.
And on the other hand, is like, well, if I have my React application and I compiled it to JavaScript, that JavaScript is going to work for exactly the same 100 years, maybe more, right? Because if it uses less of APIs, right? If the only thing that it uses is like append child or something like that, right?
Right.
Instead of like create registry or something like that for like web components, right? Like that app will actually probably work for longer than your web components, right? Because web components relies on more features, and like there's a higher chance of like some of those features getting duplicated.
Right.
So this is just I wanted to rant for the about this. It's like
Right.
this is like a kind of like a stupid argument about like, well, my thing is going to work for 100 years. It's like no, like I've been here long enough that like I remember stuff that was deprecated from the platform, and it will happen again, right? Like that's the fun part is like, oh, like once we get um I don't know, like signals, observables, like whatever, right? Like once we get them in the browser, like they will stay there forever in the exact same shape. And it's like, well, maybe not. Like
Right.
there were examples kind of like of that or the other.
Right.
In And the like the argument that like React is not vanilla is also kind of like funny to me, because it's like, well, it compiles down to vanilla, right? Like it compiles down to the same thing, right? And probably again, like probably even lower level. They a lot of frameworks will do this for like E11 support or whatever, right? Like
Right.
they will have things that like you yourself wouldn't probably write, but like the compiler will like down compile it to something else, right? So like, well, and now I have like support of the browser that like I wouldn't probably do it myself if I was doing it vanilla.
Right.
And that's the same argument for kind of like jQuery back in the day, right? So like, why did jQuery kind of like rise to the top? Because it was so annoying to write vanilla, right? And once vanilla kind of like caught up to everything that jQuery can do, you could not use jQuery if you didn't care about like older browser support, right?
Right.
So like it's still it was still like better to use jQuery if you wanted those browsers, but we were like actively like saying like, please make sure that your website doesn't work in EA6, right? Like show the banner, please, like please turn off your
Oh, yeah,
browser,
that's
right?
right. Yeah.
That was like a just like a movement, right? It's just like people just decided that this was like a better way. They actively were working against accessibility, right? You would make your site kind of like less accessible, like less users would go to your website, but it was for like what seemed like a greater good.
Right.
Right? So uh having said all that, I think uh I think that like that argument is like a bit silly, but like I hear that kind of like a lot, right? And it also like the way that you hear it is like, well, I would have used React if it would compile to web components, right? Like this way it would be like better somehow, or like this way it would like be like in line with the platform, or like better supported by the platform. But like the thing is that like compiling to JavaScript is supported by the platform. Like creating DOM nodes is a thing that like the platform is good at, right? It's like, why is using this set of APIs is better than using this set of APIs, right? Like they are both in the platform. Like
Right.
why are we talking about it at kind of like in that again? Like you haven't said any of those things, but this is just like
Yeah,
this is
what
the
you
like darkness.
hear, yeah.
Yeah, this is the arguments that you hear.
Right.
So, uh, so I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid, right? Like I'm not from like any hose. Like
Right.
I'm using tech for what it is. And in terms of web components, I would say there are like kind of like two. There are like two features that web components do that is harder to do like uh, some other way, right? So first way is like custom elements, right? So when you declare a tag, you can have like a callback that is going to be called when this tag is like declared, right?
Right.
This is a feature that you would have to do like jQuery.live,
Right.
right? Where you would have to do like mutation observers and all that stuff. So like this is a feature that is actually kind of like overall cool feature. Like that sort of stuff that you want to see in the platform, right? It's like it just it just makes the pattern that like you would use anyway just like more accessible, right? So like um I find this feature useful, right? But it's not a feature that like framework needs, right? Like framework, because of the like the way that they do everything, they have like control over everything anyway. So like they don't expect you to just like randomly put like insert like a new component somewhere in the middle of a tree, right? It's like they're like, well, we are the one who's inserting the components. We will know when this component shows up, so we will know how to call that callback, right?
Right.
So like that's the feature that like they don't care,
Right.
right? And it also implies like a specific architecture, right? So like the building your application using custom elements is like a thing that you have to do explicitly, right? You can't just like kind of like accidentally do it.
Right.
And the shape of that application is going to be much more close to like PHP jQuery shape, right? It's
Right.
like I'm generating HTML on the server. I have like a script.js file on the client, and like they need to kind of like to talk to each other, right? It's like when I'm showing the I like yesterday I was going through Fireship. I don't know. You probably know
Yeah.
him,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So Fireship did his like F kit,
Yeah.
like his stack of like how to use like Svelte and Hugo. Was like I'm generating most of my stuff kind of like statically in Hugo, but I have like a kind of like bits of interactivity with web components, right?
Right.
And um, like that's the architecture that like I think the web components are the best. I think his approach is actually not the best. Like I'm working right now on a thing that like will do that better. Because when you're using Svelte for what he's using, it actually doesn't kind of like jive as well with like the kind of like HTML kind of like first approach, because it's living in that world where like everything is kind of like handled by the framework, so it's like limited on in amounts of in like in the features that you can use there.
Right.
um I'm probably like too abstracted, like it would probably like better to be shown as a code. But
Right.
for example, he has like a button that can open a model, right? And he would produce the button tag with Hugo,
Yeah.
right? But he needs to add kind of like on click on that button with Svelte, right? What he does is that he will have like a model action or whatever, like it's called the model action custom element, right? And it will take that button as a child. What uh, he has to do, right, is uh, he creates a span that has on click, and inside of that span there is a button. So it's like, well, like why? Well, it's like why? Because like if you want to add on click in Svelte, right? It has to be inside of the framework. Like you can't just like go into inside of your child and add on click
Yeah.
there, right? So like this is the sort of like mismatch that I was like seeing. I tried solid element, which is like very similar to like how kind of like Svelte works and all that stuff. And I'm like, you guys haven't seen jQuery, I think. Just like you're not
Yeah.
doing the thing that like I need to do here,
Right.
right? And so this is I think that like the custom elements like that allow you to like just go through like all of your children, like find the button that is like your direct descendant and like add event listener on that child, and like if you're unmounted, just like remove that listener and all that stuff. It's like I think this is like great feature. I think like the first way that they introduced it was like through mutation observers, right? But like now they have like custom elements, and I think this is the thing that like is cool, except for the part that like it requires you like to have like a special kind of like shape of the app, right? But it's not that rare of a shape, right? Like a lot of the web is done with this kind of like PHP jQuery style where like I would say if you have like your PHP jQuery site, like rewriting it to web components will like make your life easier. it will make a lot of this like component thinking, right? There's like, well, if I have like a model, I don't have to say like ID model one, ID model two, right? I can just like have it own kind of like be its own component, and if I have like five of them, they know how to like not step on each other's toes, right? So
Yeah.
like that's but that's the shape that like no one knows anymore.
Yeah.
Right? It's like if you're talking to someone just like randomly on Twitter, like they will, if they will try to do something like that, they will end up with something that like Fireship did, right?
Right.
Like they still believe in their frameworks kind of like too much. So they will add like a span with on click instead of like adding like event listener on the button, right? Like they
Right.
just like don't think about it in that way anymore.
Right. Right. So
And uh-huh.
i-
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say like this the second part is like the like the kind of like the whole kind of like Shadow Dome story.
yeah, I mean, yeah, the Shadow Dom stuff is, I mean, it's cool, but it's also frustrating in some ways as well. Um, but that's a whole, that's much newer. Um, and
Well,
it's,
what do you mean?
well, like it's been I guess it's all the Shadow DOM has kind of existed for a long time, but when you're talking about it in web components, it's been updated to fit into the web component model and maybe expanded from what, like, it's expanded beyond what it has been in the past by, I would say, a considerable amount because of web components specifically.
Right. Yeah. Well, uh, uh, the history of web components is interesting, and they're like I did this kind of like a deeper dive into web components because I was working on this kind of like the jQuery style like a library, and now that I did it, now I realize that it's not jQuery, it's like a stimulus or like a GitHub
Mm.
Catalyst style. It turns
Mm-hmm.
out I didn't know that when I started. I
Right.
didn't know about those tools because like I'm not in the Ruby for like more than 10 years now.
Mm.
But uh okay, I lost where I'm going with this. But yeah, web components. So the like history of web components is that they they started working on web components in a lot of kind of like ways inspired by Angular. And if it's funny that like if you go and watch that like original Angular talk where Mishko is bare feet and he's like talking about
Yeah.
about Angular, he's like, well, we think that browsers suck and we will do like a better browser. We will just like implement a browser in JavaScript and that browser is going to be better, right? Like no one will say stuff like that kind of like anymore, but that was the feeling that like that everyone had like back when they had to support Internet Explorer, right? It's like,
Right.
well, it's actually cheaper to just like implement the whole browser, right? But where it started, right? It's like I have a link and it goes to like to a different page, and it's like, no, you don't know how to do that, browser. You're very bad at it. It's like the experience is terrible. We will do like a better link, right? So like that's why Angular had like a router, right? React didn't do it, but like uh so so that was a thing for like browsers, right? It's like, hey, browsers, we think you suck and like we don't like you, right? And what browsers heard is like, oh no, we might get kind of like we might get disappeared here, right? If like if everything that you do is done through Angular, right? Is like, well, you could do like Angular native. You could do Angular desktop, right? So like, why do you need a browser for like for any of this stuff, right? So like, if the language that you're right, if like the platform that you're using is Angular, like the browser is like a kind of like implementation detail, right? It can
Right.
be replaced at any time, right? So that started like a mad rush of like trying to appease frameworks, right? And in the end, what they thought was a good idea is to just like, well, if Angular is trying to build browser into JavaScript, we will just build like Angular back into browser. So we'll like build a browser inside of a browser,
Yeah.
and that's going to be like a part of the platform. And there is a lot of just like thinking of that time there. A lot of the assumptions that were like kind of like true then, but like they're not true now. And the kind of like the unfortunate reality of like trying to put Angular into browser, it was that like, well, no one wanted to do that, right? Is like, yes, you at Google, maybe you want to put like Angular into browser, right? But like we at Apple or we at Firefox and so on, like
Yeah.
we don't want to do that. And they started asking questions, which some people think were like unreasonable. Some people think they were reasonable, right? But they were along the lines of like, well, why would we do everything in exactly the same shape? I think that's kind of like how it ended up being, right? So, like web components at that time, it was like four things. It was shadow DOM, custom elements, um, HTML imports, and like some other one. I forgot, right? But all the browser vendors, they were kind of like convinced by like, well, this thing kind of makes sense, right? Like in that kind of like jQuery thinking is like, well, actually kind of like custom elements as just a way to kind of like encode your callbacks, and like assign them to tags and all that stuff. Like that kind of like makes sense, right? With Shadow DOM, there was like a bigger fight because Shadow DOM was designed by the way that it was implemented in Chrome at the time, right? So that was like, well, it's easy for you to do Shadow DOM because like
Because
that's just like your internal implementation,
yeah, yeah, that's right.
right? But like for us to like adopt all of your quirks, how you do it and all that stuff, like that's not great. So like the Shadow DOM was like slower to adopt, but it was still like one of the pillars of web components. So it was like right away. It was like, well, if you're building kind of like Angular in the browser, right? Like it has to be there.
Yeah.
uh, and the one that didn't happen was HTML imports, right?
Right.
So HTML imports as like a nuclear fusion, right? It will happen like at any at any time now.
Right around the corner. Yeah.
Right. But like that was the feature that was like the most kind of like out of the left field, right? It's like and I think also like that's not even how Angular worked, I think. As far as I remember. So they're like, well, like this part is fine, this part is fine, but like the HTML imports is like it's like completely kind of like out of the left field. Like why are you trying to do this?
Hmm.
So uh what was the first one? I forgot. But uh I think it's like interesting right now, right? It's like how would how everything would have played out if like Google kind of like had it way, right? And like everything as they can like imagine would have been just like implemented by everyone, and like what would be the world of like kind of like Polymer one, right? Like Web Components v0,
Yeah.
it was called back then, right? So like
Yeah.
would that be fine? Would that kind of like work? But like it didn't happen. Like the like
Right.
web components as they were set out in like 2011, 2012, 2013, 14, and so like and a few more years, right? The way that they were set out, like it just like didn't happen, right? And out of the ashes of that project, we have Lead, right? And Lead is not like trying to build Angular into a browser, but trying to build like React class components like from 2014, right? Like trying to build that into a browser. Again, this is my like personal opinion. Not everyone can like who
Sure.
cares
Yeah.
about the components
Hmm.
agrees with that. But like that's kind of like how I see it. Is like, well, let's just build in React into browser. And first of all, is like React team was never on board with that. Like they never wanted to have React built into a browser in any shape.
Right. I wonder why. That's a question I would want to know. It's you can guess why. There's you could take a stab at like why they wouldn't want that, but unless
Well,
you're
I
in their
think it's
heads.
I think it's like the like the history of like last 10 years of like React being React, right? They're like they don't want to do that because they don't think React is finished, right? Like they don't think that like observables, for example, right? They're like very simple pattern. It's like you have a constructor, you have subscribe, next, and like unsubscribe, right? It's like
Hmm.
so there are like three callbacks and like whatnot, and like signals are a bit more complicated, right? You have like kind of create signals, create derived, and it's like, well, also there's like a batching and all that stuff. So like signals are like kind of like at the amount of like react signals, like that's probably where like browsers will not even like try to put them in, right? Promises were better because it was like two callbacks. It's like better than the observables. It's
Yeah.
just two callbacks,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's where we know that like it can get into browsers. But React is like too big and too it's doing too much to ever try to be inserted into a browser, right? And the version of React that they had in 2014, right? It had like at least like three changes kind of like since then,
Hmm.
right? And it's like, would it be cool if you had like React 0.13 in your browser and like none of the websites are using that anymore, right? It's like, what's the point? Like, what does it give you to you,
Right.
right? And but like they're trying, right? The like lead is a kind of like an attempt of doing that, and that's why they have like some flag from like fast web components framework right now, right? So fast was written like about 5 years ago. I don't remember, but like it was already built on like on the some of the ideas from Solid and all that stuff, right? And they're like, well, actually, like this is like a better architecture. Like, why are we doing like React from 2014 in the browser, right? If like
Right.
this is actually like more performant and like more straight to the DOM and all that stuff. So um, yeah, I'm one of those people who like agree kind of like with React Corniato is like in oh sorry with Ryan Corniato on like kind of like on the like probably not building in like kind of like solid into a browser. And I agree with like React team of like, well, let's not build kind of like React into a browser,
Right.
right? Just give us the APIs that kind of like make sense on their own, right? And we will build the components as we want them, right? The component kind of like model by itself is like too fuzzy to put it to kind of like to cast it in stone, right? It's like, well, that's what it has to be. And the one of the consequences of that right now, right, is like you can't have like a web component that is responsible for like a title tag or like a meta tag, right? Because
Right.
the components can only be inside of the body, right? And that was like perfect um, way of thinking about it in 2014, right? When they were doing the like the show you the like when you go to Gmail, it shows you loading, right?
Yeah.
And then you're kind of like in the application, and everything is like handled by application, right? But it doesn't feel right in the age of like Next.js and Astra and all that stuff. It's like you don't know the title on the server when you do the request. What are you like? What are you thinking about it, right? But
Right.
like at that time, it felt like the component is a thing that is happening client side, right? And if you go to Shoelace right now, like the first thing that they're telling you is like, oh, by the way, like just like hide all of your components until like you have the JavaScript for them, right? Just show the loading bar as in Gmail in 2005. Like what's so wrong about that,
Right.
right? And it's like, well, that felt like a good idea at the time, but like now no one is going to kind of like see through that, right?
Right.
so so the components like as an idea turned out to be like a much wider variety of things than like a component as it is defined in web components, right?
Right.
It's like, well, the web components are like a very specific, very like kind of like product of its time and all that stuff,
Right.
right? But the component that you have in like Solid, the component that you have in like in Svelte 3 or Svelte 5, right? Like those are going to be different. and the component that you have like in React, or the component that you have in like in React Server components, right? Like they are all are completely different things, and the definition of component as it's given by web components seems like completely outdated, like in our terms, right? So that's why you will hear a lot of like web components people is saying, oh well, don't worry about the component parts. It's like we
Right.
don't like that word anymore.
Right. Right. It's fallen out of favor. Yeah. Okay. So I think my from hearing everything you're talking about, um, we probably agree on like a vast, huge amount of things more than we disagree. And I think one of the prominent things that I'm hearing from you, like your like explaining some of the history and explaining some of your personal history through some of these things, is that generally speaking, these libraries and frameworks on at least on the web, um, are attempting to solve problems that people are running up against when they're working with the web. And some of it sometimes is working around what's already in the browser, and sometimes it's creating something that's not in the browser and you need it. But regardless of which thing you're trying to solve, you're whether it exists or not, you're trying to solve something. The issue that I have is that most people cannot speak to the degree that you and others like Ryan, for example, or there are other people who I've talked to that who are quite smart and have like a good breadth of knowledge. They can't speak to the reasons why these things even exist in the first place, like at all. Period. What they know is that it does exist, and what they hear is, um, I'm going to use the word propaganda because sometimes that's what it is. It's propaganda for use this thing because, um, then you don't exactly what you said. Then you can just turn your brain off, bro. Like, do you really want to go through what JLarky went through, and you want to have all this history, and you want to deal with all these different? No, man, someone else figured it out for you. Someone figured out that like you needed jQuery to do like your element selectors in a nicer way. Somebody figured out in React that you have to layer on like a DOM management system over top of your DOM management system. Like, but don't worry about those things. Just use the thing. We had a problem. Go solve it. And I I would argue that you have brought up some good reasons why these things do exist. For example, why jQuery came out in the first place was to solve some things that were missing in the browser, for example. And then it was a good thing because we got query selector all out of that. It pushed the browser to be like, wait, you guys in jQuery land are doing this and you hate us for not giving you this ability? Fine, we'll add this ability in the browser, and now we get to benefit from document.query selector and document.query selector all, which came essentially from jQuery, right? Those are good things. But we've gone too far. That's where I currently stand. We've gone too far into the world of, we're going to solve a bunch of problems for you, uh, and all you have to do is turn off your brain, and you don't have to understand why you're even here in the first place. Just come on in and do your thing, and we got you covered. And what that leads to is it's a necessary lead into people no longer understand exactly what you said, why they're doing what they're doing, and so they're looking up how to sort an array in this framework, which is really just, bro, have you not done JavaScript at all? It should be a basic 101 thing. And it's even worse then when you compound it with not just the libraries pushing this and obfuscating or indirecting these things, but you also have things like computer science degrees which don't teach you these basics. You have boot camps that don't teach you these basics. Not all, there are exceptions where you taught well, but it seems mostly not. And so you look around a room of people who like know React, and when there's a fundamental problem of like, wait, how do we solve this outside of React? Because say React can't do it, Svelte can't do it, whatever it is, everyone goes, I don't know. I know how to solve it in React, but now I don't know what to do, right? So is that like, am I kind of not too
Yeah,
far
and,
off
and
base.
I'm seeing that kind of like all the time. Again, I think it was like in one of Prime videos about like, well, back in the time, like they were called sub routines. So like introduction of like functions and the functions having like states and arguments and like returning like all that stuff, right? That was like pure overhead, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't think about it as that anymore, right? But and it's like if you're using like Java, like just like why don't you have a function? You have like a V table lookup before you get the method, right? It's like that's pure overhead. Like why would you do that? So it's like
Yeah.
it's kind of like crazy to think about like some of those abstractions that you kind of like jumping kind of like in and out, right? And it's like once you're like 7 layers removed from all of that stuff, right? Like not everyone kind of like writes shaders every day and all that stuff, right? It's like
Yeah.
you don't think about those things anymore, right? You're like, well, my FPS is low, but like, oh, apparently I was like creating like a ton of objects like on each loop, all of that stuff. And it was like, oh, actually, all of those patterns that I learned about like immutability that help like make code like more maintainable, I need to cut down on some of those, like pull the objects or like reuse some of the like stuff, right? Like use mutable structures and all that stuff because like that's how actually like the computer works, right?
Right.
And like in React, right? It's like most people like they just like don't think about like the layer that is going to like lower than React, right? They're
Yeah.
like, well, this is how you do it in React. And it's like unless you see uh like someone like Aiden who shows like, oh, by the way, I type one character and there's like 1,000 like re-renders. It's
Yeah.
like unless you see that, you don't even have to like think about it, right? And like, and the point of React and like the point of like what they're working on is to make sure that you have to think about it like less and less, right? And you have to understand that like a lot of the decisions that how like React team kind of like thinks about it or like how they are working on, they're like, why did they have like concurrent mode? Why are they having like a compiler now, right? Like why are they doing more stuff on the server? Is that for the application that they're writing, for the level of like engineering that they have, right? Even though every one of them can solve like 1,000 lead codes in like 5 minutes, right? When they introduce like compiler, they see practical like performance improvements, right? When they introduce like this and that, they see that like the code that they are the like the experts in, right? Like they still forgot to memorize here. They still forgot to like to think about like this callback there, right? So like they are working on a platform that will give you the tool that you can use wrong 90% of the time, right? And it will still provide the, like the proper result in the same way as operating systems. Like the yes, I forgot how it's called, but like there's like a cooperative, like a multi-threading and like not multi-threading, maybe multi-threading. Yeah, I don't remember those like lower terms, but like there is a multitasking. Yeah, yeah. So you have like a multitasking operating system, right? And like one of them is cooperative, where like once you finished your work, you are kind of like giving out like the control to operating system.
Right.
But there's like another one that like does interruptions and like no matter where you were in like in
Right.
the stack, it will like stop you and like give the control to operating system itself, right? Like the other one is much more performant. That's why, like in DOS and all that stuff, like that's what they were using it, but it's not as stable, right? And React is kind of like a that operating system that even if you have a software that takes 100% CPU, it's like it would have killed your like DOS machine, right? The rest of the application will still work because that's just a component that you took from another team, right?
Yeah.
And like, well, that's how they wrote it. Like you can't always like fix all of their bugs. You just want to have like a box that you can put it in, right? And it's like limit the kind of like the exposure to those slower like or whatever things, right? So like if you think about React is in that sense, is like it's an operating system for your components to live in a browser so that like one component can't kill like the whole application.
Yeah.
Like all of those decisions make perfect sense. And it's like, yeah, sure. Like, would it have been better to not send 100 kilobytes of JavaScript? Sure. But when you're an application that has 2 megabytes of JavaScript, like that doesn't matter anymore.
Right. Right. So I would like I take a pretty hard stance on the opposite end, where I just ask the question, why do you need why do you need to have that in the first place? Like my question would be, why are you creating an application on the web that um runs into that problem in the first place, where you have a
Right,
component or some portion of the page that kills everything else, thus
right,
requiring that, hey, the React people are like, well, this is a problem, let's solve it, right? And so to kind of like to agree in part with what you're saying, when you look at these problems in a vacuum and you go, well, how do we solve this problem? I can agree, like, sure, that makes perfect sense why you would want to build this thing to solve that problem. My stance goes one step farther. Why are you in that problem space in the first place?
right,
And
exactly.
and do you know how to solve that problem without your library or your framework? Can you even answer why you're there in the first place to begin with? Because then if you can't even answer that, then you don't know how to solve it beyond the thing that you're working with, right? And I would I would actually be okay with more people using libraries and frameworks, if more programmers in general could answer
Would
the question of
articulate
like,
why they're using it. Yeah,
why am I
yeah.
doing, what's going on here, right? But that's not what we're seeing, right? So and
Yeah,
that's where I take a harder stance against, well, I think React in particular is the worst offender. I don't really have any like quantifiable data to prove that.
right.
It's just what I see, right?
Yeah, and I will just say that, like, right, is like I'm like, well, actually, like in a bigger team where you're like sending 2 megabytes of JavaScript anyway, and it's like most of it is like third party, so you don't even like control like what's going on
Right.
there, right? It's like,
Right.
well, in that situation, like React is actually like a kind of like quote unquote a good thing,
Right.
right? But like, why are you in that situation in the first place?
Right.
And there is the same kind of like line that is happening about like micro frontends. There are like different definitions about like micro frontends. So the one that I like to use is like along the lines of module federation. So the idea is that the application that you're loading on the page is built from modules that are built from like different teams, right? And
Yeah.
if you can do that kind of like during build time, that's like along the lines of like monorepos and all that stuff. But
Right.
if you have to use like runtime that like your like node application like pulls in like JavaScript code from like some sort of registry based on like the latest version and like what is compatible as you all of you, and like that sort of stuff is like what I'm calling micro frontends here, right? It's
Yeah.
like this like speaking of like pointers and like objects and all that stuff,
Yeah.
right? It's like, well, this is stupidly huge overhead that makes everything 10 times more like complicated for like no reason. Like, why would anyone do that, right? And
Right.
it's like, well, what they want to do is that they want to have like a common like a chat support widget thing, right? And they want to go and like change the like the greeting like happy holidays, right? And it's
Right.
like they don't want to redeploy 10,000 applications that all are using this package. They want this to be like its own kind of like thing, right? That you are kind of like pulling in, right? And
Right.
it's like, if you are at that scale, if that's the problem that you're solving, right? Micro frontends look like a solution, right? It's like,
Right.
and most of engineers should kind of like be striving toward like not being into that problem like at all, right? So it's like,
Right.
well, if your problem is like, I don't want to rebuild 10,000 apps, is like, well, why do you have 10,000 apps? And why do
Yeah.
you need to rebuild them, right? Like
That's right.
why that part is not simpler? Like
Right.
and like sure, if you are in that situation, the like micro frontend seems and like module federation seems like a good solution, right?
Right.
But like, why are you in that situation? And this is the same thing for React, right? It's like pendulum definitely swung like all the way to kind of like to SPAs, right? Like
Yeah.
everything has to be an SPA, like, and well, the like half of the problem is that like, well, all the kind of like bootcamp graduates, that's what they learned, right? And like we have to kind of like we have to like wait through that period until they caught up to like to the like the real world, right?
Right.
And if you are if you are in a like in this like swing where everything has to be in React. And it's like, why? Well, everyone else is doing React, but like, why? Well, because it's popular. Why?
Yeah.
Because it got popular. Like, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
So like, if the if we are using microservices or like micro frontends or React, if that's like a given, right? You will have a lot of people who will see that like that wasn't the right solution, right?
Right.
Like it is the same way as like 10 years ago, everyone was raving about microservices, right? Now everyone is like, well, we actually tried that, it sucked, and here's like why you shouldn't use microservices, right? We are now in that kind of like wave of like, well, everything should be an SPA. Like we tried that and it sucks, right? And
Right.
it's like we are now living through that kind of like through that wave of like people kind of like disillusions with the like default kind of like solution,
Yeah.
right? And it's like, well, of course, that's what's going to happen, right? So like in the same way, uh, in the same way as like people like that was like a kind of like a huge kind of like Twitter drama, right? Where
Right.
like Rich Harris who like built like the whole kind of like API structure of Svelte parodying like the web components kind of like spec, right?
Yeah.
He went out like last year and he's like, well, that was a stupid mistake. We shouldn't have done that. Like web components suck, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh no,
Yeah.
well, you were the one who was leading that thing of like use the platform and all of that stuff, right? So like,
Right.
and now you're kind of like disillusioned because you actually tried to use it and like you saw all the ugly kind of like sides of it, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, and of course it's going to happen with kind of like React and that kind of like SPA first mentality, right? It's like
Right.
in 2000 let's say like 18 or like 19, right? Like when you would say, oh, by the way, I just finished my blog using React, everyone would say, yes, that's such a great idea, let me hire you, right?
Yeah. So
That
true.
doesn't sound as reasonable today anymore,
Right.
right? And it's like, did like the tech change that much kind of like since then? Like was React better then? And it's like no, right? It's like there were like more there were just like more people trying it. There were and the I think I think we wouldn't have been going so much hard from like kind of like backlash from like a whiplash or whatever it's called,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
from like SPAs back to kind of like server rendered stuff if it wasn't for mobile devices. I think what happened is like what Alex Russell. I don't agree with Alex Russell on a lot of things, but like this is the thing that I agree on.
Uh-huh.
This is the like the chart that he shows, right? Like when the web components were happening, when we were trying to put a browser inside of a browser with Angular, right? Everyone was using desktops, and Moore law was like at its highest. And if something was slow today, just wait a year and it's going to be fast,
Right.
right? When that formula broke with like tablets and phones and all of that stuff, and especially like kind of like cheap Android phones, when
Yeah.
that formula broke, that's where a lot of the default assumptions of like, well, just do everything client side only, right? Let's just do everything in React. That's where it like started to crumble. When we had like 10 years of like Android, like a lower end, like $200 lower end kind of like Android devices, for 10 years they like didn't change like the performance, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, oh no.
Yeah.
Like oh, none of our stuff is usable because everyone has like M1 MacBook. It works great on their computer, but
Yeah.
like if you try to open it on your like middle kind of like of the range Android, like nothing works,
Yeah.
right? And that's like I like that's how I'm like justifying the like the performance work that I'm like doing at work and all that
Right.
stuff, right? I was like, well, it's cool, but like if someone is opening your blog on the phone and they have to wait from a like a loading spinner, that sounds kind of like out of touch, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So man, I'm finding it difficult to disagree with you. So there's there's two things that I want to add to what you're saying. I think you're right. Like a lot of the reasons why certain things got pushed are because at the time there were hardware limitations, or you could even point to like software specifications that didn't exist, like we talked about before, etc. And you're trying to solve those. But to exactly to your point, if to me it seems silly that if you're a business who wants to have as many eyeballs as possible on your website in order to try and convert those to sales, that you would by definition limit the access to eyeballs by having something that will not operate well on, say, a large swath of the world, literally the world. Like I think it's over
Right,
30% who do not have the devices that we are have the luxury of having in North America. So
right,
if you want to make more money, if that's your goal and you want to pay people more money, why are you supporting these kinds of things, right? Just to add to that. And then one more thing that stands out to me is as you're describing, as you're explaining, like, hey, there's a bit of like backlash or whiplash from we went all the way in. We went just straight like a pedal to the metal, you know. I have microservices all the way, and then you go, oh, we're off the cliff now. You know, it's too late. There's no stopping. We're gonna crash, and we're
yeah,
gonna have to
that
build a new
sketch
code.
where it's like the Galacticus doesn't like deploy for next 2 weeks. We
That's
can't.
right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So to me, I feel like there are certain industries where that kind of whiplash is an understandable whiplash where you can't move faster than understanding where you're at. But we're in a particular industry where we build our own tools for ourselves, first of all, which is kind of a rare thing. So we're kind of the masters of our own domain in terms of everything that we build is basically by our own hands, including the things that we use to build those things. And we are heavily data driven, maybe not 100%, but we depend on like, you know, a lot more objective, like even just the way that you program things is like a purely like a logical entailment of series A, B, C, D, E, right? And yet we seem to be operating every time this cycle comes and goes on vibes, what
Right,
feels good, right? And we never look back and go, wait, what are the things that we learned last time? Oh, maybe we shouldn't be adding complications here and there. Maybe we should be asking the question why. Maybe we shouldn't be making things easier or harder, things like that. But we just somehow we tend to forget that.
right,
And then just to kind of bring it to like, this is why I like HTMX, because HTMX is one of the few libraries that has come out in, I don't know, maybe five-ish years, maybe a bit more, where the using HTMX might be like, I don't actually need this, but the encouragement behind HTMX is to encourage you to actually discover why you don't need it. It's not to
all right.
discover why you're dependent on it. It doesn't lock you in, like unlike React, which I feel like once you get into it, it's like that's it, I'm done. Now I'm locked in, right? Whereas HTMX is like, no, 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 you're going to give this a shot, and if you like it and you want to continue using it, we're here. But actually, what we're really encouraging you to do is understand why you're doing this weird thing that we're telling you to do, and it leads the programmer into understanding better what's going on under the hood, right? So I just gunshotted those points over to you.
Yeah, and I again like because of my position of like I opted into React, right? I opted into like this and that, and like I had to make that decision. I had to like weigh in, kind of like, is it worth it? Is it not worth it? Right? It's like uh, kind of like I I wouldn't say like I would like just like write my own React or something like that, but like at the time it felt like none of the abstractions that the like React was bringing in, none of them seemed kind of like extra, right? It's
Right.
like I and coming from that background where it all kind of like made sense, it all was like gradual and all that stuff. It's like a different thing from like person who probably like didn't have even like a decision to
Right.
look into any of that stuff, right? They just like they were just like dropped into it and they just had to like inherit all the complexity, right? It's like, of course, my kind of like vision of it is not going to be the same as
Same. Yeah.
someone else, right? It's like when React Server components were introduced, I was like, oh, cool, this is like will help me like solve this pattern, right? And people who like never heard about the server before, they just like don't even understand where it like starts, like what the issue it solves and all that stuff.
Right.
I will bring up this thing is like what makes React kind of like more what makes React kind of like harder in this situation is that like the kind of like the framework, the UI framework or like this component model, it is like different from like kind of like older web. It is a thing that you can't kind of like easily kind of like opt in and out of. It's not like um it's hard kind of like for me to say it, but like that's why I'm working on like my kind of like web components library, and maybe if we have like another call we can talk more about it.
Yeah,
But
totally. Yeah.
that's a thing that like I had like this kind of like I had this frustration with like all the web components users were using web components as like kind of like a facsimile of React. And it's like, well, if I wanted React, I would have just used React. Like React is better at React than like what you are trying to do here, right? Like you
Right.
have to you have to jump through like more hoops to kind of like to get there, right? So it's like I don't want any of that. I want the DOM kind of like APIs. It's just like I wanna find a button and I wanna add like an event listener on it, right? So like
Right.
just give me that. And it was like none of them gave me that. And it was like, why are you so why is it so hard? Why is it so it's like why is that approach that was like very easy to do like in jQuery days?
Right.
Why is it kind of like impossible to I forgot the word, but like to do the same approach here, right? So like why does Fireship has to add on click on span, right? Instead of like just like adding on click on button.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that like got me through last like 6 months probably now,
Yeah.
just like figuring out all the landscape of like all the web components or all the that kind of like semi-declarative kind of like HTMXy things where you're like, well, I'm going to like express what I'm trying to do through an attribute that's controlled through HTML, right? As opposed to like kind of like having everything in JavaScript. But having everything in JavaScript has its own benefits, and this is especially true for React or Solid. It's less true for like for stuff that tries to like be like more kind of like HTML-y,
Yeah.
where you have like in Vue, right? Everything is like valid HTML, right? So like it's just v if something, like
Yeah.
v each and all that stuff. And it's like, cool, this is like a nice abstraction, but what I lose here is like I don't like everything is a string again, as it was like in knockout days, right? So
Yeah.
like how do I know if that variable exists, right? Like, can I hover over it and see the types and all that stuff? That's what I
Right.
get from like a kind of like real programming language,
Right.
like what I get from JSX, right? And that allows me to have like I have a ref, right? And that ref has to be mentioned kind of like twice. Like it has to be mentioned here where it checks the types that like this element can be assigned to this ref, and it's checked there where I'm like adding like event listener on the ref, right? It's like all of those things that are like not just HTML strings, but like actually kind of like a TypeScript or runtime checks and all that stuff. That's the sort of thing that like frameworks give it that like you can't get right. A simple example is HTMX, right? HX get equals URL. Like, what if this URL doesn't exist, right?
Right.
like who is going to check that? And because HTMX doesn't take ownership over that, like they're not going to check it, right? And
Right.
that's kind of like for you to figure out like a system that to solve it. If in React with server functions, I can do form action equals, and I'm importing the action, right? Like the TypeScript checker, the like the bundler and all of that stuff. Like they will check that like all the stuff that I'm referencing actually exists and all that stuff, right? So like I'm getting all of the like the static checking that you would get from like a if you're using like Go or like a Java or whatnot, it's like, oh, I'm using type safe language, cool, and HX get a string. It's like, is
Right.
that string checked? No, it's string. I know that's
Right.
a string, it's not a number, right? But like
Right.
that's how much my like type checking goes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's like a going back all the way back to like your original question, like
Yeah.
where would you use React, where would you use like HTMX, and like this is the sort of like stuff of like how many checks do you want to do, right? Like how many things do you want to like rely on framework for you to check, or like bundler for you to check, or TypeScript for you to check,
Right.
as opposed to like just like having like a test or like whatever, right? Or just like
Right.
better reporting if
Right.
stuff goes wrong. So it's not as easy, right? It's a similar question of like, do you use TypeScript, do you use JavaScript? And for like a bigger company that it has more chances to use React because they need this like multi-threading kind of like a thing, right? For a bigger company that has more chances to use micro frontends and the module federation and like whatnot, right? Like
Right.
for them, the answer is going to be React, just because it gives more kind of like checks, more opportunities to kind of like to check your homework, right? It like don't hope for everything to be there and for all the strings to be there, right? And it's like
Right.
I started with JavaScript when I didn't have any types, right? And it's like
Right.
you just hope that you named your like function unique enough that you can like string replace it, and like that's you're changing the right one instead of like
Yeah.
like some other one,
Right.
right? So well,
Yeah. So so I can agree that like these tools are good for automating away things that you would have to like manually discover are issues and then manually sort through if you need to make changes or whatever. Um, I find the argument for that these days in particular not as appealing though, because the consequences of using this are quite clear. So what's being like what you're describing is more of like it's a subjective preference. So to me, all that's happened is that you've swapped in, I don't want to deal with does this string or URL exist, and instead what I'll do is I'll deal with like a bigger build tool chain, slower
yeah,
compilation times, or other problems that come with this library or framework. And that's kind of why it's in a different landscape where programmers were far more versed, like you are, about like the reasons why and whatnot. That would be a more compelling. I would be okay with that explanation. But just these days, I'm like, well, what the consequence of making people's lives easier by not having to worry about, did I name this right? Does this URL exist? Is that we don't have the ability to like essentially nurture programmers who might otherwise be extremely talented and smart if they had the opportunities to go beyond the thing they're using, right? I'm trying to keep in mind that of the time, because I know you don't have a lot of time, but
yeah. I will probably do like two more things. So first one is like, do do developers can like realize what they're opting into, right? And it's like they probably can't like even express what I just said, right?
right.
They're just like they just heard from like from YouTubers that like they should be using React and
Yeah.
Next, and right, and it
Yeah.
solves everything,
Yeah.
and they just have to kind of like appeal to authority and just like go with that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Uh, do what do I do, right? Is I'm trying to kind of like opt in into things that I need and opt out of the things that I don't need, right? It's like, for example, is like, do I want to pay for kind of like a runtime cost of React on the page if all that I need is like check that like this string is the same as this string? It's like, no. What can I do for that? I can use React in like server only mode, right? I can compile it to HTML kind of like once, right? And like don't have to worry about it in runtime, right? Or if I'm I can like use Solid instead of React, for example, right? And like if I what I'm getting is like TypeScript and Java and JSX, right? It's like, well, I can just use like a smaller framework that can do TypeScript, it can do JSX, right? So
Yeah.
like that's kind of like how I was dealing with that.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so for kind of like new developers, I think new developers don't get like enough credit, right? So a lot of decisions were done kind of like for them, right? And one of those decisions is that you're using subroutines instead of just like directly inlining everything, right? It's like
Yeah.
there are so many layers of stuff that like new developers don't have a say on, right? It's like, well, someone choose like a Linux and Docker and Kubernetes and like 10 other things like for them, right? It's like, do they have to like figure out that one first, right? Like, do you have to know how your like observability through open telecom or like whatever it's called, right? Like,
Yeah.
do you have to know that? Like,
Yeah.
how is that more or less important than to know how to like sort arrays without jQuery, right?
Of course.
It's
Yeah.
it's a, it's a, it's like a complicated thing for developers, right?
Yeah.
And the usual kind of like advice is like, well, kind of like at least know a bit about the kind of like one layer below, right? That you're actively like touching, and do whatever is interesting for you, right? Like if you're deploying like a stuff on like Kubernetes and the Kubernetes is like interesting to you, just like go and learn about it, right? If you're writing a function and you know that's like, oh, actually, if I don't do like React on click, instead I do like a use effect and like inline the like event listener inside of use effect, this will like make my like application 10 times faster. If you know how to do that, right? Like do that, like learn more about it and so on. So yeah, so new developers, it's kind of like more complicated than it's I don't feel comfortable saying, oh, by the way, you need to learn like this lower level thing instead of this lower level thing because you're a web developer. Is like,
Right.
well, learn whatever you feel like it. But it does seem silly when it's like when I kind of like day to day talk to like React developers and they don't know HTML, they don't know CSS, they don't know JavaScript, they know React, and that
Yeah.
feels wrong. But that's the job that they're in, right? Like
Yeah.
they're in the job of like doing React, and I guess they know React or like they know how to ask AI about React.
Yeah.
So one other thing is that it's kind of following from that, but this is kind of like there was like some other question before I wanted
Sure.
to
Sure.
to
Yeah.
say then, but um, my like a bit of like my problem with the kind of like I forget how it's called. There's like a game development like a trend where they do like everything from scratch, something from scratch.
Handmade.
Handmade, yeah.
Yeah.
So like all of this like handmade stuff, right? Is like, well, of course Unity is like bad, right? Of course even like Godot is bad and so on, right? Of course the thing that you're going to do for like your game that is going to be like specific for your game, you can like you can do it so that you don't inherit all the crap, right? That you don't need, and you can do the things that you need like better or like faster or more straightforward, all that
Yeah.
stuff, right? But like how far does it go, right? Like if I was building a game for Nintendo, like do I also build a cartridge? Do I also build a like hardware for it? Like why did you stop at C? Like that seems like an arbitrary like line, right? It's like why didn't you go and like create your own hardware, right?
Right.
Why don't you manipulate the like the CRT like tube, right? Like that
Yeah.
seems like a fun problem that you can probably solve. Like if you have access to that level, you will probably solve it much better, right? You can skip the scan lines because you can directly go back to like rendering your frame, right?
Right.
It's
Yeah.
like it's the same thing about like the having functions, all that stuff. It's
Yeah.
like it is cool to learn all of that stuff. It is good to learn all of that stuff, but I don't think it's by default better. So that's the same argument that I said before, right? About like, well, I'm using the platform, so like my thing is better. And it's like, well, 9 times out of 10 is not. There was just this podcast that was I kind of like listened to the half of it and I couldn't anymore. There's guy
It's probably
he
one of
was
mine,
on
I bet.
there was this guy from on JavaScript Jabber podcast, and he's like, "Let me teach you about like PWAs, and like PWAs are the platform. They are the best. Everyone who's using like not the platform, they are like stupid and like and ugly, right?
Yeah.
And their mom doesn't like them." And I like the few things that he said, right? He's like, "Oh, I have this website, I have this website," and it's like I clicked on all of them. They all look like they were designed in 2014. They all have the like all the layout shifts that are like that are bad, and like that like, you can have like with or without React, or like and like,
Yeah.
so just because you use the platform, right? Just because you think that you are like educating someone about something, it doesn't mean that you know everything. It doesn't
Right.
mean your stuff is like better, right? Like I opened his application on my phone, and on my phone there's like the toolbar or whatever, like it wasn't positioned correctly, right? And it's like, well, that sort of stuff, right? It's going to be kind of like wrong or right, like no matter the technology. And I listen more to people who care about users.
Right.
I listen more to people who care about like the end product being good
Right.
than to people who are like peddling the like exact solution, right?
Right.
And it goes all the ways. It goes all the ways from like use the platform because it's better. No, it's not. It's better if you do it better, and it's worse if you do it worse, right?
Right.
And all the way to like kind of like Next.js, right? So like, hey, we have like a image optimization and so on, right? And it's like, have you tested it? Does it actually work better? Like, are you sure? Right? It's like, well, it does it for you, but like, does it do it good?
Right.
And it like an image optimization is the thing that like I tried so many frameworks, and like all of them do it like slightly bad, right? And it's like, well, I guess it was like good enough for them to close that ticket or whatever, right? But
Yeah.
like I would rather kind of like listen to people who said, okay, I tried this built-in thing, like this is how to make it actually work, right? Or I tried to this like platformy way, and this is how to like to make it actually work. I think that like the tech is like people don't see the tech, people see the like the experiences, right? If I click on something, does like spinner show up, right?
Right.
If I click on something, can I go back and like not lose my state, right? And it's like I don't care if it's local first, I don't care if
Yeah.
it's like server driven, like none of those things are like what I care, right? I care that you wrote it kind of like right, you tested it and it like didn't break kind of like later on, and that's why I probably like care about stuff like the references to things like staying staying like correct, right? Then
Yeah.
like, well, it was like that's why I would have stuff like a string loading as like a status, right? So like so that I know or like satisfies, I guess, like in our TypeScript, right? Like loading satisfies like this type. It's not just a string loading. It's a string that has like a very specific meaning and refers to this type. So if I change this type like somewhere else, I know all the places that are using it, all the places are referring it.
Yeah.
And yes, I spent like more time writing all of that stuff, right? But like that's the time that I like spent on like maintenance down the line. So
Right.
yeah, that's like yeah, it's a small rant about like I don't actually care about tech that much.
Yeah. No, I think I mean, to sum it up, React sucks and HTMX is the best. That would be the conclusion. Of course,
Yes.
yeah. Uh no, I think in general, I would say, um if there's a fine balance between the trade-off of the thing you're using and the thing you're learning, and we've leaned too much into the thing you're using. And if people understood more about like why they're doing certain things certain ways and what the problem spaces are and whatnot, it would be a lot better overall. And it would almost make whether you're using thing A or not thing A somewhat irrelevant, or even or more irrelevant than it is today. And I would be okay even with that. And I think it sounds like you agree with that. It's like it doesn't necessarily mean that like um, you know, in such a world, if we had a magic button, we could enter that world. React might still be around, but it might be very different, and it might be used in different cases, and it would and ideally it would be used far more knowledgeably than what we have today, which is just let's just go for it because who cares. I think we both agree that that's kind of like the ideal space that we should be in, and we seem to
Right.
not be.
Yeah, and there's like the joke that I think Primogen said is like everyone is saying that they're using the right tool for the job, but like what they actually do is they find like the job that can let them use this tool,
Oh
right? Like
yeah.
that's
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's very true. Yeah, okay. Well, I have like I could talk about this with you for quite a while, but I know you have to go because I've kept you more than I thought I would, and I appreciate your time. Um but I would like to chat with you again if you're up for it.
yeah,
And
yeah, sounds great. Yeah, thank you for inviting me in, and thank you. I think it was Max who kind of like
yeah, that's
kind
right.
of like mentioned
Yeah.
us kind of like to each other on Twitter, and
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's uh, it's rare where people who kind of like how do I say it? Usually, the people who you hear the loudest, they have like a very like one-sided kind of like opinion,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And people who people who give like a more like a weighted opinions, right? They don't get as much limelight. It's like it's a harder clips to kind of
Yeah.
like to share on social media.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for kind of like listening to my like not hot takes.
Yeah, no, no. You know what? I mean, I sit here on stream sometimes and I go over like literally like academic journals on software stuff, like statistics and stuff like that. It's boring as heck. But what I want to be having these conversations, I want people to actually push back and argue with me, and I want to do it publicly because the whole point is that at least if you're having the argument, you're trying to solve a problem together. And if you can do so and walk away at the end and be like, okay, cool, like maybe we argued and it got heated. This one obviously didn't, but um, that's better than not talking at all or just hearing the one side and never hearing any pushback because it gets
Right.
blocked or just
Yeah.
ignored or
Once you
whatever.
mute every account about React on Twitter, you're like you're doing pretty well, and that's kind of like what happened to like Mastodon or like Blue Sky, right? Like
Yes.
everyone who's like who likes web components, they're like on Mastodon now, right?
Yeah.
So like they happy there, like they
Yeah.
don't see any disagreements now.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you're among friends. What are you going to argue about? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, this is good. I'm glad we did this and I want to do this more. And I'll try, now that we've talked about this, I'll try and come up with some different questions to kind of like push back on you. Maybe we could actually get into a little bit more of like an argument now that we've kind of laid out the groundwork here. I think that would be fun and interesting. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that sounds great.
yeah, thank you. I appreciate you coming on and your time. And yeah, we're gonna do this again. I'm gonna reach out to you.
Yeah,
Okay.
bye.
Thanks, JLarky. We'll see you later. I'm gonna end this call now.